Hello, I'm continuing my Superman reviews with Superman 2. Now, this review is specifically going to be on the Richard Donner cut of Superman 2. Now, this movie has two different versions of it, and once again, this review is going to be on the Richard Donner version, because that's the version that's available on this DVD set here, and that's the version that I saw most recently. The original cut of this movie, or the cut that was released to theaters, I actually haven't seen that version since I was a little kid. So once again, this review is going to be on the Richard Donner cut of Superman 2. Now, when Richard Donner was shooting the first Superman movie, he actually was shooting this movie simultaneously with that, because both these movies were meant to be released, like, back to back. Like, essentially, this was all meant to be, like, one long epic that was split into two parts. Like, that's kind of what Richard Donner was going for with the first Superman movie and then this movie. But unfortunately, when Richard Donner was shooting this movie, he was taking it in a direction that the producers really didn't want them to take this movie in. Like, Donner wanted to go in a much more serious direction. Even though the first Superman movie did have a lot of comedy in it, he wanted this to be much more serious, but the producers wanted it to be much more lighthearted and much more campy and much more like a comedy, so they ended up firing Richard Donner and they hired Richard Lester to come in and pretty much reshoot most of what Richard Donner already shot, and basically the Richard Lester version of Superman 2 is what was released to theaters back in 1980. But a few years ago, they were able to piece together Richard Donner's cut of the movie by finding footage that Richard Donner originally shot for this movie, which they kind of combined it with footage that Richard Lester shot, and they were essentially able to assemble Richard Donner's director's cut of this movie. Even though, to the best of my knowledge, even this version is not exactly what Richard Donner had in mind, to the best of my knowledge, I'm pretty sure the version that we got is probably the closest to Richard Donner's original vision. Now, once again, I haven't seen the Richard Lester cut of this movie since I was a little kid, so I can't really comment on what some of the major differences between this version and the Richard Lester version actually are. Now, just based on the Richard Donner cut, I can honestly say that I actually think I like this way more than the first one, and that's just based on the Richard Donner cut. And I think I like this a lot because I did kind of grow up with this when I was a little kid. Like, I remember seeing this when I was a little kid and actually thinking this was the first Superman movie when I saw it as a little kid. Now, keep in mind, when I saw this as a kid, I saw the Richard Lester version, which I believe is much goofier, and from what I remember of the Richard Lester version, I remember it being pretty goofy. This one has a much darker tone than even the first Superman movie had, and that's something I really liked. I mean, there's still some goofy stuff in this movie, like the way Lex Luthor escapes from jail in this movie is actually really freaking goofy, and I'm not sure how much of that was Richard Donner and how much of that was Richard Lester, because I know they did take some scenes from the Richard Lester version for this cut of the movie. But overall, I would say this one is definitely much darker than the first one, and definitely has a lot more character drama with the character of Superman. Now, in the film, Christopher Reeve once again reprises his role as Superman, and just like in the first one, he does a fantastic job as Superman in this movie. But what I really liked about Christopher Reeve's performance as Superman in this movie specifically is, even though he, from our point of view, like from humans' point of view, he has the powers of a god, he's still, in a way, in his own way, kind of a human being, at least emotionally and psychologically, and he has real human flaws. And Margot Kidder once again plays Lois Lane in this movie, and I really loved a lot of the chemistry between Clark Kent and Lois Lane in this film, and you could definitely tell that Christopher Reeve and Margot Kidder had great chemistry with each other. And a lot of this film really does focus on the relationship between Clark Kent and Lois Lane. Now, in the movie, Gene Hackman once again plays Lex Luthor, and I actually liked Lex Luthor a lot more in this movie than I did in the first Superman movie. Like, Gene Hackman did do a really good job in the first Superman movie as the character of Lex Luthor, but I honestly found the character to be a little too goofy in the first one, even though his plan was pretty diabolical because he was planning on pretty much destroying the state of California and killing millions of people, so he technically was pretty threatening when you stop to think about what his plans were, but I don't know, he just came off as a little too goofy in the first one, and in this one he comes off as even more evil because in this one he's actually planning on pretty much selling out his own race for his own personal gain. So I think as a villainous character, Lex Luthor came off as a much more evil person in this than he was in the first one. But probably the most memorable performance in this movie is Terence Stamp as General Zod, who is the main villain of the movie, and he does such a good job in this movie as this character, and Zod in the movie is the right level of funny and scary at the same time. Like, he's definitely a threatening villain, but he's also darkly funny as well, and Terence Stamp does such a good job in this movie as the character of General Zod. Now, the plot of Superman 2 is it picks up right where the first one left off. Now, in the beginning of the first Superman movie, you saw Jor-El, Superman's father, condemn these 3 criminals on the planet Krypton to suffer in the Phantom Zone. Basically, the Phantom Zone is this other dimension that people on Krypton used to send criminals to, and pretty much this other dimension, it's almost like hell in a way when you stop to think about it, because pretty much criminals who are condemned to the Phantom Zone have to spend eternity there, and like the gateway to the Phantom Zone is kind of in the form of this like floating plate of glass, and pretty much Zod and these 2 other criminals on Krypton get condemned to the Phantom Zone, and you see them get stuck in like this floating piece of glass that's like floating through space. Now, at the end of the first Superman movie, Superman discovered that Lex Luthor was planning on setting off bombs around the San Andreas fault line, which would have caused a huge earthquake, so Superman at the end of that movie launches those bombs into outer space, and pretty much in this movie you realize that one of those bombs blew up right by the floating piece of glass where Zod and the other 2 criminals from Krypton were trapped in, freeing them from the Phantom Zone. And since these people are from Krypton, on Earth they have the same powers that Superman has. Now, the other 2 Kryptonians that are helping Zod are Ursa and Non. Now, Zod was already a character from the comics before this, but both Ursa and Non are characters that were created for both this and the first movie, but those characters would later get incorporated into the Superman comics. Now, in the movie, Lois Lane figures out that Clark Kent is Superman, and Clark, realizing that he can't hide this from Lois anymore, basically in the movie they both develop a romantic relationship, and Superman realizes that he can't live a normal life with Lois as long as he's Superman, and eventually in the movie he does discover a means to actually become human, but unfortunately after he does this, he also discovers that these 3 beings from Krypton have now come to Earth and are now threatening to take over the world, and Clark is the only one who can stop them, but unfortunately he's now trying to live out this normal life where he's not Superman. Now, as I said before, I really loved this movie, and I actually did like this better than the first one. Like, overall, even though there is a lot of goofy stuff in this movie, overall, I would say this film has a much darker and much more serious tone than the first movie did. This particular cut of the movie, like the Richard Donner cut, is a lot darker than the first movie was, but I know the Richard Lester version is much more lighthearted. And I also feel like in this movie you get a lot more character development with Superman and Lois Lane. I also like the villains of this movie much better than in the first movie. The only thing I don't like about this movie, and once again I'm talking about the Richard Donner cut, is I really don't like the ending of this cut of the movie, and I know the Richard Lester version had a different ending. Like, I really didn't like the ending of this movie because I don't want to give it away, but it kind of makes the whole movie kind of pointless, in my opinion. So it's not a flawless movie by any means, I just personally enjoy it more than the first movie. I also really liked the themes of this movie. Like, this film definitely has the theme of responsibility. Like, in the film, Superman wants to become a human so he can live this normal life with Lois Lane, and he wants to be happy, and ultimately, like, in the film, Superman has to make a choice. What's more important, his happiness or him protecting the world from people like Zod? Now, a lot of people have interpreted Superman as being a metaphor for Jesus Christ, and a lot of the comics have definitely played into the whole Christ-like allegory for Superman, and if you want to think of Superman as a metaphor or an allegory for Jesus for this movie actually reminded me in some ways of The Last Temptation of Christ. Now, the movie The Last Temptation of Christ wouldn't come out for another 8 years after this movie, but The Last Temptation of Christ was a novel written in the 1950s. And basically, the whole idea of that novel was, what if Jesus really didn't want to be the Messiah, and there was a certain point of that novel where Jesus was offered the chance to live a normal life, but it also showed you the consequences of Christ choosing to live a normal life, and in some ways this movie kind of reminded me of The Last Temptation of Christ in the sense that you have Superman wanting to live a normal life, but unfortunately there are dire consequences for Superman trying to live out this normal life. And if you really wanted to talk like religious allegories for Superman, you could even look at the relationship between Superman and Jor-El as kind of being like a Jesus and God kind of relationship. And you could even look at Zod as representing Satan in a way, because Satan was condemned by God to suffer in hell, and in this movie, General Zod was condemned by Jor-El to suffer in the Phantom Zone. So in a way you could almost draw like an interpretation of Zod and Ursa and Nan as being like metaphors for like the rebel angels. Now, I might be reaching a little too deep there, like even deeper than the filmmakers were actually intending, but since a lot of people make the Christ-like analogies with Superman, I figured I decided to draw some analogies of my own. But yeah, that's my review on Superman 2, and bye.